Your parents might have told you that monsters don't exist, but serial killers sure do. These real-life monsters prey on all types of people, and they're not limited to one particular gender. With that in mind, let's take a look at the most notorious female serial killers of all time. Nannie Doss was known by nicknames like the Jolly Black Widow and the Giggling Granny. Her killing spree began in the 1920s and lasted all the way until 1954. Born in Alabama as Nancy Hazel, she didn't have a great start in life as she grew up with a man who was more dictator than father. In fact, he forbade her to even speak to a boy until she turned 21, so it's hardly surprising that she married a man within 5 months of meeting him. That marriage quickly went downhill. Nannie and Charlie Braggs had 3 children in 3 years, a time controlled by a manipulative mother-in-law and an abusive, constantly drunk husband. After the birth of their 4th child, the 2 middle children died. The official cause was food poisoning, but Braggs suspected actual poison and took off with their eldest. In 1943, Doss's newborn granddaughter died mysteriously, and her daughter swore that she saw her mother stab the baby with a hat pin, though there was never proof. More children and grandchildren died under mysterious circumstances, and it wasn't until Doss's 5th husband died that an autopsy was ordered. It turned out that he had a stomach full of arsenic. Doss's estimated total death toll was 11. She died of leukemia in 1965 in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The term baby farmer might sound like a terrible thing, but it actually wasn't that bad. It was simply a person who would take in and care for the unwanted children of others. Alas, many of these early foster care babies died of neglect and abuse. And then there was Amelia Dyer. Dyer was born in a small English town in 1837, and according to family members, she was never quite the same after she contracted typhus as a child. She was violent, and it wasn't long before she became estranged from her family. She trained as a midwife and a nurse, eventually running a boarding house for pregnant women. Many people paid for her assistance with the delivery and then left their babies in her care. On March 30th, 1896, a package was fished out of the Thames River. Inside was the body of a baby girl who'd been strangled with a piece of white tape. The packaging that the baby had been wrapped in contained some vital clues, including stamps and an address. That pointed authorities to the direction of Dyer, who was already known for having a suspicious number of babies die while in her care. She was arrested and hanged after killing upwards of 300 children. Life in Japan was difficult in the years following World War II. That was a time that a midwife named Miyuki Ishikawa decided to take it upon herself to make people's lives easier. Ishikawa worked at a maternity hospital where she was responsible for the deaths of between 103 and 169 children. Women would give birth, couples would be in a bad financial situation, and Ishikawa would convince them that it would be cheaper to pay her and her doctor colleague a decent sum of money rather than take their children home to raise them. False death certificates were drawn up, and nobody was any wiser until January 12, 1948. That was when 2 police officers discovered the remains of 5 children. The investigation that followed only led to 70 more bodies. During the trial, the defense argued that the parents were to blame as they were the ones who abandoned their children. That line of reasoning actually received support from a significant section of the public. Ishikawa was handed an 8-year jail sentence, though she ended up appealing to get that cut in half. Leonarda Cianciulli was born in southern Italy in 1894. She was well-liked and popular, but she was also incredibly superstitious. At the heart of her superstition was a fortune teller's prophecy that all of her children would die, and that almost turned out to be true. Of her 17 pregnancies, she had 3 miscarriages, and only 4 of her children survived. She became convinced that sacrificing others in a black magic ritual would help preserve her remaining children, so she did just that. Cianciulli used her position as a shopkeeper and various tall tales to lure her victims in. Once they were in her shop, she drugged them and then killed them with the help of a trusty axe. She got rid of some of the body parts by mixing them with a caustic soda and then dumping the buckets of the remains into the septic tank. And it gets even more macabre. She took her last victim, boiled that pot an extra long time, added some cologne, and then, as she revealed in her memoir, I was able to make some most acceptable creamy soap. I gave bars to neighbors and acquaintances. That woman was really sweet. Nursing homes are full of horror stories, and it's been that way from the beginning. One of the first American nursing homes was the Archer Home for Elderly and Indigent Persons, situated in the picturesque town of Windsor, Connecticut. It was founded by John and Amy Archer in 1907, but when John died in 1910, Amy was left with a child and a stack of bills. Worse still, 48 people died between 1911 and 1916, and not all of those deaths were due to natural causes. Amy Archer remarried in 1913, and by February 1914, her new husband was dead, and he'd conveniently left her with a new will and his entire estate. Residents' family members were getting suspicious as early as 1914. They went to the Hartford Courant, and when reporters started digging, they discovered that the causes of the deaths were almost always stomach-related. Once autopsies were done and arsenic was found in their systems, it became clear what was going on. Archer, now known as Amy Archer-Gilligan, was found guilty. Her original sentence of hanging was reduced to life in prison. She killed somewhere between 24 and 48 people, and she ultimately died at the age of 88 in the Connecticut General Hospital for the Insane. Those who knew Gesche Gottfried called her the Angel of Bremen because, as far as the townsfolk knew, she faced indescribable hardship. She lost parents, children, husbands, partners, and friends, but through it all, she nursed them through their illnesses. It's believed that Gottfried suffered from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. People with this condition cause real or imagined illnesses in those closest to them so that they can care for them. Gottfried's weapon of choice was a rat poison called mouse butter, a spreadable fat laced with arsenic. She started by killing her first husband and her kids, and then she moved on to neighbors, a landlady, and a maid. Gottfried was caught when one of her intended victims got suspicious enough to have a doctor examine the food she'd prepared for him. She was arrested and beheaded in 1831, the last person to be publicly executed in Bremen. Anyone visiting the city can still see its lasting tribute to her, a spit stone in the town square. It's reserved for Germany's most reviled criminals for passerbys to express their disgust.
That one touched the ground. That one touched the ground.
On April 28, 1908, Belle Gunness's farmhouse burned down. Despite the best efforts of a farmhand named Joe Maxon, the fire consumed Gunness and her 3 children. But investigators were immediately suspicious as Gunness's body was missing a head. A former farmhand named Ray was arrested in connection to the incident. But it wasn't long before another man named Asa Hegelian showed up at the sheriff's office looking for his brother who'd met Gunness through a Lonely Hearts column, left home to move in with her, and then disappeared. Hegelian helped search the property after the fire and started to leave before a nagging feeling pulled him back. When he spoke to Maxon and learned about a recently dug hog lot, he asked authorities to start digging. He recognized the first half-rotted face they uncovered as his brother's. Authorities pulled so many body parts out of the ground that they eventually stopped counting. The corpses were unidentifiable, contained traces of strychnine, and had been partially destroyed with the help of quicklime. It's believed that Gunness killed over 40 people. The head of the body from the fire was never found, so even amid questions of whether or not it was actually Gunness, the farmhand was found guilty of arson and died in prison. What happened to Gunness is anyone's guess. In 2017, a nurse named Genene Jones was indicted on murder charges. The victim was 2-year-old Rosemary Vega, who had died on September 16, 1981. This indictment came on the heels of another one for the death of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. Jones had been working at the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit in a Texas medical center. When she was brought up on these charges, she was already serving a 99-year sentence for the 1984 death of a 15-month-old girl. Jones first went on trial in the 80s, and even decades later, authorities aren't sure how many children she killed, but they believe that it's as high as 60. She injected children under her care with toxic levels of various substances, sometimes in the same room as concerned parents watching over. Tracking down victims proved difficult, as many of the hospital records had since been destroyed. But when prosecutors reopened the case in 2017, they made it clear they were out for justice. And since there was no statute of limitations on murder cases in Texas, they could keep digging. The impending possibility of Jones's release from jail kickstarted the additional investigation, and in 2020, she pled guilty in exchange for a life sentence.
For her to decide on her watch who lived and who died is nothing short of evil.
In 1908, Dr. Linda Hazzard wrote and published a book called Fasting for the Cure of Disease. She advocated the idea that in order to be truly healthy, you needed to let the digestive system rest through periods of fasting that would last for days. She had no real formal training and no medical degree, but she was still an officially licensed fasting specialist in Washington state. She opened the Hazzard's Institute of Natural Therapies, which attracted a wide range of patients. The treatments were harsh. In addition to required fasting, there were enemas that lasted for hours and so-called massages that patients reported were more like beatings. Authorities were alerted to what was going on when the family and friends of sisters Claire and Dorothea Williamson became concerned after not hearing from the girls after they set off to the institute. Hazzard was arrested, and it was estimated that her medical treatments had killed at least 12 people. She served only 2 years in prison before being released, setting up another school in New Zealand and finally dying from prolonged fasting of her own. Helene Jegado is officially connected to only 3 murders, but it's thought that the number of her victims could run into the 30s. She was executed in 1852 after decades of killing. Part of the reason she got away with it for so long was that her method of choice, poisoning, could be easily covered up during cholera outbreaks. Her methods were simple. She posed as a domestic servant and then poisoned those who employed her. And it wasn't just her employers. She also killed her sister, and when she returned to her hometown to bury her, she killed her aunt and 2 others while she was there. Jegado also regularly stole from those whom she worked for, but in 1841 she seemed to have a change of heart. She dumped her supply of arsenic, and it was another 8 years before she started killing again. After moving on to another employer, she came to the end of her reign of terror. After a very suspicious outburst in which she proclaimed her innocence, some of the bodies she'd left behind were exhumed. Arsenic was found, and she ended up at the guillotine, where she was executed in 1852.
The guillotine!
Guillotine? Sounds French.
Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.